You don't just walk in here like you own the place. This is for our people, not for someone like you." Those words stopped the room, not because they were unusual, but because they were familiar, too familiar. The voice came from a man in a tailored blue suit, salt and pepper hair perfectly slicked back, standing near the marble entrance of the Halston Civic Center's East Wing. He was a committee chairman, the kind who'd grown accustomed to nods, handshakes, and being addressed as Sir by interns and donors alike. His name was Walter Reynolds. He had power, and he was used to using it. He had just barked those words across the lobby at an old black man holding a manila envelope, wearing a neatly pressed brown blazer and polished boots that had seen more mud than most people's entire lives. That man was Lewis Fletcher, 78 years old, a retired Army Master Sergeant, logistics specialist, and battlefield engineer. The kind of man who never raised his voice because he never had to. And yet here he was, being told to leave. Lewis didn't flinch. He simply adjusted the envelope under his arm and replied, calm as a sunrise, "I have an appointment." Walter scoffed and gestured to the security guard behind the desk, a younger man who looked uncertain. "I don't care if he's got an invitation from the governor himself. This area is for planning board members only. He's not one of us." "But I was asked to bring these documents," Lewis said, holding out the envelope. Walter stepped forward and snatched the envelope from his hands like it was trash. "And now you've delivered them. Thank you for your service, soldier. Now please, go home." Across the room, a woman in a gray suit froze mid-stride. Her name was Eleanor Kim, the Assistant Director of Veterans Affairs. She had personally invited Lewis to this meeting, a closed-door session to review a proposal for building a new Veterans Rehabilitation Center on unused city property. She hurried toward the confrontation. "Wait, Mr. Fletcher is here on my behalf," she said firmly. "He's part of the presentation. He's the one who designed the community care routing model we're voting on today." Walter laughed. "You let him design a logistics plan? With what, his crayons and bedtime stories from the war?" It got quiet then. Real quiet. Lewis said nothing, just stood still, his back straight as if under inspection, eyes steady, unblinking. The silence said more than 100 protests. The receptionist, watching behind her desk, lowered her gaze. She knew what was happening. Everyone did, but no one said a word. Walter turned to Lewis again and waved toward the door. "You're not needed here. We have professionals handling this now." Lewis slowly turned toward Eleanor. "Would you like me to leave?" Eleanor looked torn, but she shook her head. "No, sir. Please stay." But Walter was already marching toward the conference room, tossing the envelope onto the receptionist's desk without so much as a glance. "Let's get this meeting started." And just like that, Lewis was left standing at the edge of a room he had built the foundation for, again. 55 years earlier, in the red mud of Da Nang, Lewis had done the same thing. He stood at the edge of a battlefield perimeter, blueprint in hand, mapping supply routes under mortar fire. When asked later how he stayed calm during ambushes, Lewis once said, "You don't panic when the plan is clear. You panic when no one's listening." And that's what this felt like. No one was listening. Back in the lobby, Lewis sat down on a narrow wooden bench against the wall next to a display case of past mayors. None of them looked like him. He took a breath, pulled out a small notepad from his coat pocket, and began sketching again. Not blueprints this time, just simple square boxes and lines. A habit. A language only the forgotten still spoke. On the far side of the room, Eleanor was arguing quietly with the receptionist, then trying to reach someone on her phone, but Walter had already sealed the room behind him. "This is what they do," whispered a janitor nearby, older, quiet. "Block the same doors we once held open." Lewis looked up. The janitor nodded respectfully. "They forget, but we don't." Lewis smiled faintly. "Not forgetting is half the battle." At that moment, a door creaked open again. But it wasn't from the side anyone expected. From the main rotunda, heavy glass doors swung wide. The sound of dress shoes echoed across the marble like thunder. In walked a tall man in a dark blue Air Force uniform. Not retired, active duty, medal rack full, 3 silver stars on each shoulder. Lieutenant General Douglas K. Rayner. He walked with purpose, heads turned. The receptionist stood up so fast she knocked over her water bottle. Walter, hearing the commotion, opened the conference room door and froze mid-sentence. Rayner approached Lewis, stopped directly in front of him, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "I heard someone told you this room isn't for you. They're wrong." He turned to the staff behind the desk. "My grandfather served under Master Sergeant Lewis Fletcher. He was wounded in Korea and only made it home because this man rerouted medvac coordinates in a storm with no backup. So when I heard someone tried to block him from attending a veterans care discussion, I cleared my calendar." Walter took a step forward, defensive. "I had no idea who he was." Rayner cut him off with the calm power of command. "You didn't care who he was." He turned to Lewis and extended his arm. "Let's go build the future, Sergeant. The kind they told us we couldn't have." Lewis rose slowly, took the general's arm, and walked past Walter without another word. "You just sat there like a statue and let them talk down to you?" That was the voicemail Louis Fletcher received later that evening. It was from his niece, Monique, a fierce young attorney in D.C. who'd never quite accepted the quiet dignity her uncle carried like a second skin. She was fire to his earth, lightning to his stillness. Louis had listened to the message once, then again, then set the phone down and said nothing, just as he always had when the world confused volume for value. But the words echoed, not because they hurt, but because they reminded him just how loud the silence had become. That night, Louis stayed at a small hotel not far from the Civic Center. The front desk clerk, a young Latina named Rosa, recognized him. "You're the guy from the news clip, right? From the meeting?" Louis raised an eyebrow. "Already on the news?" She nodded. "Someone filmed it, the general coming in. People are sharing it like crazy. Twitter, TikTok, Facebook." Louis chuckled softly. "Guess silence doesn't stay quiet forever." She smiled and handed him a room key. "Thank you for not yelling back. You made him look small." He didn't reply, but the nod he gave said more than gratitude. It said, "Understood." Back at the Civic Center, Eleanor Kim was in damage control mode. The clip of the incident had already gone viral. Multiple news outlets had picked it up. One headline read, "Veteran denied entry to meeting meant to serve veterans." Others weren't so polite. Eleanor received 4 apology requests from board members within hours, not because they felt remorse, but because they felt exposed. Walter Reynolds, meanwhile, went silent. Behind closed doors, he claimed he'd been caught off guard and misinformed. But the footage didn't lie. His face, his words, his posture. No PR firm could spin contempt into confusion. The next morning, Louis returned to the Civic Center, not as a guest, but as a co-presenter. This time, when he walked through the east entrance, the doors opened without resistance. A young woman held them for him. Another handed him a bottle of water. It was subtle, small, but it was different, and that difference mattered. Inside, the meeting room was full. Half the committee had returned, the rest had sent delegates. Local news cameras lined the back wall. Everything was recorded now, not because anyone demanded it, but because the risk of pretending no one was watching was gone. Louis stood near the front, beside Eleanor. She whispered, "You okay?" He nodded. "Let's work." His proposal wasn't flashy. No big numbers, no soaring promises, just clarity. He walked the committee through his plan for decentralized care hubs, small units that could serve veterans in underfunded areas, connecting them to mental health, job placement, and housing resources through a single entry point. The key isn't building a palace, it's building a door that no one can block, Louis explained. The room went quiet. Walter, seated off to the side, didn't say a word. His face was stone. But that silence was no longer power. It was accountability. After the meeting, reporters swarmed. Mr. Fletcher, what would you say to people who still don't think men like you belong in rooms like these? Louis didn't hesitate. I'd say, keep making those rooms, but don't forget to leave them open. Another reporter. How does it feel to finally be recognized after all these years? Louis smiled faintly. Recognition's not the point. Change is. That night, Monique showed up at his hotel. No warning, no call, just fire in her eyes and a bottle of ginger tea. I'm proud of you, she said softly. He raised an eyebrow. Didn't sound like it yesterday. She rolled her eyes. I was mad because I knew what you were doing. You let that man insult you, humiliate you, but you didn't fight back. You just stood there. I stood through it, he corrected. There's a difference. Monique sat down beside him. How do you do that? How do you hold that kind of stillness? He looked out the window at the quiet street below. You hold it until someone else learns to. Then he turned back to her and added, Silence isn't weakness, Monique. It's a choice. But once it stops changing things, then it becomes surrender. That night, Louis received a call from Lieutenant General Raynor. We've got a request, the general said. A group of veterans from 7 cities wants to replicate your model hub. Would you be willing to consult? Louis leaned back in his chair. Would I be compensated? He asked dryly. Absolutely. And more importantly, they'll listen. Louis closed his eyes for a moment. Then I'll speak. Across the country, dozens of civic leaders began reevaluating who got invited into decision-making rooms. Veterans like Louis were no longer being asked to share war stories. They were being asked to share solutions. And suddenly, those rooms started looking very different, more diverse, more humble, more open. Because the door that was once blocked was now held open by the very hands that had been pushed away. You think a medal makes you an expert? That was the first thing said to Louis Fletcher when he stepped into the Veteran Advisory Board meeting in Millstone County. It came from a city consultant, early 40s, pressed suit, hair slicked back with confidence that came not from service, but spreadsheets. His name tag read Devin Keller, Veteran Affairs Strategy Lead. The word veteran on his badge wasn't earned, it was assigned. Louis didn't flinch. He just set his satchel on the table, pulled out a single folder, and opened it. Inside, a blueprint of the decentralized Veteran Resource Hub model. No, Louis replied calmly, this makes me an expert. He topped the plan once with his finger. And the medals? They remind me who I had to lose just to be heard. The room went still. Keller's smirk faltered, but not fully. Okay, Mr. Fletcher, let's walk through your hub idea, but don't expect everyone to clap just because you've got scars. There was a beat of silence. Then Louis looked around at the dozen attendees. A few were fellow veterans, a few were administrators. One woman, sitting near the back, was clearly a social worker, her notepad already full of scribbles and arrows pointing toward access gap, discharge bias, and survivor trauma. Louis smiled softly and began. He spoke slowly, deliberately, not selling the plan, just showing the need. He talked about veterans in rural areas who had to drive 3 hours just to check a benefits box. About female veterans whose trauma went unspoken because the VA wasn't built for their stories. About black veterans who were more likely to be flagged for fraud than supported for housing. He wasn't angry. He wasn't loud. He was undeniable, because the weight in his voice didn't come from theory. It came from memory, from watching friends spiral, from writing eulogies for men who didn't die in battle, but died because battle never left them. Halfway through, someone raised their hand. It was the social worker. I've read a dozen proposals in the last 5 years. Yours is the first that includes a no wrong door policy. Why? Louis looked at her, then at the room. Because shame keeps more veterans out than distance. If the first person they meet tells them they're in the wrong place, they won't come back. The room went quiet again. Keller said nothing this time, because even he knew there was no retort to truth that cuts clean. After the meeting, a young vet named Mateo approached Louis. He had the look of someone trying to appear okay, pressed shirt, steady voice,
but his eyes twitched too much, and his smile ended too early. "Mr. Fletcher," he said, offering a hand. Lewis took it. "I probably don't remember you, but I saw you speak at Fort Gibson back in '03. I was fresh out of training. You said something I never forgot." Lewis waited. "You said, if no one hands you the mic, build a stage. That's why I stayed in this field." Lewis blinked. He had no memory of the speech, but the words felt like something he would have said. "You building stages now?" Lewis asked. Mateo nodded. "Trying to. You just gave me more tools." 3 weeks later, the Millstone Hub was greenlit. It wouldn't be huge, it wouldn't be flashy, but it would open, and it would be ready. Lewis stayed for the groundbreaking, not because he needed credit, but because he wanted to watch the foundation get laid, literally. He stood next to the backhoe operator and watched the first dig of earth turn over. "It's just dirt," someone said behind him. Lewis smiled. So was every foxhole I ever trusted. That same week, Eleanor Kim called. "You're a trend now, Lewis," she laughed. "Hope not," he replied. "Trends fade." "Then a blueprint. That I can live with." She told him that 4 counties had reached out asking for his input. A university wanted to archive his story. A documentary crew was asking permission to follow the next stages of his project. "I just wanted to fix a door," he said. Eleanor smiled through the phone. "Turns out you built a hallway." But recognition came with friction. In one boardroom in Chicago, a funder asked, "Why should we trust someone with no policy degree?" Lewis replied, "Because I survived the policies that didn't work." In another meeting in Raleigh, someone said, "There's no data to support your trauma index model." Lewis pulled out a folder. "There's 37 names in here, men and women I buried. That's my data set." There was quiet after that. Every time someone tried to reduce him to just another angry veteran, he offered something they couldn't quantify. Presence. Not just being in the room, but anchoring it. Lewis didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten anyone. He just kept showing up, kept opening doors others had closed. And each time he did, someone behind him stepped through. Sometimes a widow looking for survivor support. Sometimes a Marine with PTSD pretending it was just lack of sleep. Sometimes a teenage girl, daughter of a vet, asking if she could start a youth program in her dad's name. Lewis said yes, every time. Because that's what doorways are for. Not to be guarded, but to be held.
"You again? They're letting anyone speak these days." The voice was nasal, mocking, just loud enough to be heard over the hum of the hotel ballroom sound check. Lewis turned slowly, and there he was, Frank Weldon, the former director of Veterans Outreach in Eden Falls County, the man who, years ago, had handed Lewis a denial letter and told him to come back when he had real credentials. Now Frank wore a shiny new badge. National Veteran Policy Summit, Chair. Some doors never close. They just move upstairs. Lewis didn't reply at first. He looked Frank over. Same slicked back hair, same tight smile, same subtle condescension worn like cologne. "I remember you," Lewis said, calm, flat. Frank grinned. "Of course you do. I've been doing this work a long time." Lewis tilted his head. "You've been talking about the work a long time." Frank's eyes narrowed, but he didn't take the bait. "Break a leg up there, Fletcher. Just remember, the room's full of people who actually studied this stuff." Then he turned and walked away. The ballroom was packed. Rows of professionals, researchers, policymakers, non-profit leaders. Most had flown in on expense accounts. Lewis walked onto the stage in his gray flannel jacket and worn boots, carrying nothing but a folder. He didn't start with a greeting. He started with a question. "How many of you have ever sat with a vet on the day they almost didn't make it?" The room hushed. No hands went up. Lewis nodded. "Then let me tell you what that feels like." He told a story, not from a textbook, from memory.
He described a night in 1972, a radio transmission that cut out mid-call, a squad that never got extracted, a 21-year-old Lewis sitting under jungle canopy, praying to hold the signal just 10 more seconds. He described survivor's guilt that didn't wear off after 5 years, or 10, only got quieter. He described walking into a benefits office 30 years later and being told he didn't qualify for grief counseling because he'd never been officially diagnosed. And then he said the sentence that made the room stop breathing. You don't need a PhD to know when someone's not okay. You need to listen like your life depends on it, because theirs might. In the front row, Frank Weldon folded his arms. In the back, 2 young Marines in dress blues stood still, eyes locked on Lewis like they were hearing someone say what they'd been trying to explain for years. When Lewis finished, the applause was quiet at first, then rose and didn't stop for a long time. Later that night at the networking reception, a woman approached Lewis. She introduced herself as Dr. Lena Farrow, clinical director for a mental health initiative in D.C. I've read 20 trauma response proposals this year. Yours is the only one written in calluses and breath, not buzzwords. Lewis smiled. That's how we used to send coordinates. Breath and grit. She laughed. Would you come speak to our congressional oversight group next month? Lewis paused, then nodded. I'll come, but only if someone in that room actually knows what it's like to wait for a folded flag. The next morning, Lewis stepped into the hotel elevator. Just as the doors were closing, a hand reached in and stopped them. Frank Weldon, of course. He stepped in, buttoned his jacket, then stared straight ahead. They rode in silence until the 7th floor. Then Frank said it, quietly. You embarrassed me in front of everyone. Lewis didn't flinch. Didn't mean to, he said. You just stood too close to the truth. Frank snorted. You think you're some kind of symbol now? Lewis looked at him. No, I'm a door. One they tried to keep closed. Now I stay open so others don't have to knock. Back in his room, Lewis opened the window. The city stretched below, glass towers and concrete lanes. But somewhere out there, he knew, was a kid in uniform about to come home and find a system waiting to bury his pain in paperwork. He sat down, opened his folder, wrote a single sentence at the top of a blank page. Don't build systems to impress senators. Build them to save one life. Then he started outlining the next hub.
You're not on the list. Those were the first words Louis heard that morning, standing at the side entrance of the Capitol building. The young aide held a clipboard and a look of thin impatience. He didn't glance up when he spoke. He just scanned the names again. You sure this is where you're supposed to be? Louis adjusted the cuff of his shirt. This is where I was asked to be. The aide sighed. Sir, we've got over 200 invitees. If you weren't sent an official pass... Then a voice rang out, sharp and cutting through the bustle like a blade. Is that Mr. Fletcher? Heads turned. Coming down the hallway was Dr. Lena Farrow, heels clicking, voice full of purpose. Mr. Fletcher is our keynote. He's not on the list because he wrote the damn thing. The aide blinked, embarrassed. Louis said nothing. He simply nodded at the aide and walked past him, the same way he had walked through decades of doors that tried to stay shut. The rotunda was full. Legislators, veterans, press. The air buzzed with the static of microphones and polished applause. But Louis wasn't there for applause. He stepped up to the podium, unfolded a small page from his coat pocket, and placed it carefully on the wood. Then he looked out and saw them. 3 young men in uniform, one in army dress greens, another in navy blues, the third in a plain white shirt with a single dog tag around his neck. Behind them sat a row of parents, hands folded, faces tired, but eyes locked on Louis like the next 10 minutes might finally explain what no one else had. He began with a pause, then said, There's a grave on the south edge of Eden Falls Cemetery with no name.
The room went still. I visit it once a month, bring coffee, talk for a while, because the man buried there got turned away 3 times before anyone listened, and by the time they did, it was too late. He let that hang, then continued. That man saved 6 lives in Da Nang, held a radio tower alone when air support was 22 minutes out, but his paperwork had a typo, so he became a footnote instead of a name. A woman in the second row dabbed her eyes. Louis looked down at his notes, then pushed them aside. I didn't come here to convince you, he said. I came to remind you. He told them about the first time he tried to get counseling after the war and was told he had to be unemployed first. He told them about the vet who slept behind his old VFW hall for 2 winters because the shelter intake form asked for a DD-214 before offering a bed. He told them about sitting in the waiting room of Millstone Resource Center, watching a 19-year-old girl with a navy tattoo and a black eye fill out her benefits application with trembling hands and being asked if she was someone's dependent. She said no. She said, I was the gunner. The room cracked open. Something unspoken passed through everyone sitting there. Then came the moment they wouldn't forget. Louis reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small brass plate. Faded, scratched. It read, Authorized personnel only. He held it up. This, he said, used to hang on the door of the resource center that turned me away 22 years ago. He paused, then placed it gently on the podium. I keep it to remind myself what we were told, that some doors aren't for us, that our uniform didn't buy us a seat, that our stories were disruptive. He turned to face the lawmakers. You don't need to open every door. You just need to stop locking them. When Louis left the Capitol that morning, he didn't walk out alone. A group of young veterans followed him. Some shook his hand, some hugged him. One young woman whispered, You said what we've been screaming in silence. Louis touched her shoulder and replied, Then keep screaming until silence isn't an option. A week later, back in Millstone, a new plaque went up on the center's entrance. It read, The Lewis Fletcher Veterans Welcome Hall. Every voice counts, every door stays open. Beneath it, etched into the glass doors, No voice unheard, no signal lost. Louis didn't go to the dedication ceremony. He stayed home, sitting on his porch in the quiet morning, sipping coffee from a mug that read, Old soldiers don't fade, they teach. Beside him was an unopened letter, formal, with the seal of the Department of Defense. He knew what it was, a long overdue commendation, an apology, maybe a medal. But he didn't open it. He didn't need it. Because outside his window, a car pulled up, and 3 young men in uniform stepped out. One held a notebook. One carried a camera. The last held a folded map labeled Future Veteran Resource Sites, Phase 2. Mr. Fletcher, the first said, we came to ask if you'd help us design the next center. Louis stood, grinned, and said only 3 words, Open the door.